The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I'm Jordan Campbell, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Jordan Campbell. A decade ago, in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins detailed his former life spent working for multinational corporations and global organizations, cheating foreign countries out of trillions of dollars by means of extortion, fraud, sex, and even murder. Now he's out with an updated version, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, published by Barrett Kohler. Mr. Perkins joins us today. He was formerly chief economist at a major international consulting firm where he advised the World Bank, United Nations, IMF, U.S. Treasury Department, Fortune 500 corporations, and governments in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Since then, his books on economics, geopolitics, and indigenous cultures have spent more than 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, are published in 33 languages, and have sold more than 1 million copies. He is a founder and board member of the nonprofits Dream Change and the Pachamama Alliance. And joining us to critique the book is Kyle Hauptman, executive director of the Main Street Growth Project, and a member of the SEC's Advisory Committee on Small and Emerging Companies. He was an economic advisor for the Romney for President campaign and spent 7 years as a trader of sovereign debt and interest rate products. He ran trading books in Tokyo, New York, and Sydney for Lehman Brothers and Jefferies and Company, serving most recently as Senior Vice President in the Fixed Income Division. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining us. So, John, could you give us, in a nutshell, the main thesis of your book?
So to begin with, essentially my job as an economic hitman was to identify countries that have resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money would not actually go to the country. It would go to our own corporations who would make big profits by building infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants and industrial parks. They would benefit a few wealthy families in the country, but the people that own the industries and commercial establishments. But the majority of the people would actually suffer pretty significantly because they didn't have the money to buy electricity, couldn't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people, and yet money was diverted from education for them, healthcare, other social programs in order to try to pay off the interest on the debt. In the end, the debt would never be paid down. And so we'd go back and say, since you can't pay your debt, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations without any social regulations or environmental controls on it, or privatize. Sell off your electric utilities, your water and sewage system, your schools, your jails, all your public businesses to our corporations. And when that didn't work out, when we failed to convince these presidents to do that, the jackals would come in, people that either overthrow governments or take out their leaders. And that I talk in the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman about how I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and Omar Torrijos of Panama. They were both taken out, assassinated. And so the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman goes into how much worse that's gotten since 2004 when the Confessions came out. I think we can really see a watershed moment as 9/11 when things really began to switch in this country. But what's happened since 2004 is the economic hitman system has spread from the developing countries to the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. And in fact, it's created a failed global economic system, what I call a death economy, an economy that's based on war, debt, fear, and the very destruction of the resources upon which it depends. It's a failed system. We must change it. And so a lot of the book is about how we can turn that death economy into a life economy that actually regenerates destroyed environments, cleans up pollution, and gets rid of the causes of desperation and terrorism, a true economy that will work for people across the planet.
Thank you so much, Kai. Thank you so much, John. And Kyle, would you mind to share your critique of the book?
Yeah, I got this a couple weeks ago. First of all, it's a hell of a life. Saudi Arabia, Panama, I mean, you know, this, compared to most people, right? All around the world, pretty interesting, right? And at non-random times either. You weren't backpacking. You were at some pretty intense times, right? So I'm sure there were some traumatic moments, but my first thought was this is a human being's life, and this is pretty interesting. One other thing, in terms of kind of how we started and commonalities, you mentioned in the book you thought these folks at your company, Maine, or wherever, were looking at where you came from, your personality, and kind of targeting that, right? And trying to play on you in a way to your psychology. Anyway, you're from a small New England town that for part of the year, because you had an elite prep school there, is that right? Had this other social class, these rich kids and the elites from these other countries, you know, that was a pretty normal New England town, but part of the year had these other folks. I'm from Bar Harbor, Maine, okay? For the summer, 4 months or whatever, we had these other folks, right? We were townies, right? Same kind of thing. And, you know, the summer people, the big difference is summer and winter to them are verbs, right? They're nouns to us, right? I don't summer anywhere, right? But yeah, and it was interesting at your beginning when you talk about the psychology. So middle-class guys from little New England towns that are, if they were like all the other towns around them would just be little towns in America. But what was different was part of the year there were these other folks that were from a different world, from a different social class. And it probably affected us both. You said in the book it affected you.
Yeah.
I'd never had anybody analyze me like that. You said these guys did. But anyway, that's a commonality. The one thing I kept looking for in it was the whole shtick seems to be these economies are screwed up. Fair enough. And the repairman who came in, it's like you crashed your car and you took it to the mechanic, and the mechanic did a terrible job. Did things to benefit the mechanic himself and did not do the job that we're supposed to do, right? You walked away worse off. All right, so you deal with that two ways. We can talk about why is this mechanic so terrible? Also, why do you crash your car? That's the other way not to go to a mechanic, right? You don't crash your car, you don't go to a mechanic. These countries were managed terribly. And we have a whole history of poor countries, including the one we're in right now, all around the world. South Korea, dirt poor country, poorer than North Korea, and now half these people here are on Samsung phones, of no country has to be poor. All of this is happening. All of these things is happening because of terrible economic management. It is not because these folks need rich white people to come in and save them, ever. Do you have a stable currency? Do you have the rule of law? Is it easy to do business? Do you have simple, easy to understand taxes? Do you have transparent government? Do you have a true free enterprise system, including the press, which is an industry? None of those countries are in here, right? These are all the ones that are screwed up. So to take issue with an oil company coming in and taking resources, fair enough. I understand taking issue with it, right? But even your things at the end, you know, about like for entrepreneur, well, Hong Kong and Venezuela were equally wealthy about 60 years ago, and Hong Kong today is a prosperous place that doesn't have refugees from. It has people trying to illegally enter there. You know the gates test, open the gates, see which way people go? Mm-hmm. Everywhere who says what I just laid out, the simplest thing that has led to everybody in the world getting out of poverty, always the same. Rule of law, the free enterprise system, simple, transparent government. And the thing that you see it in China, you don't even have to do it that well. Even kind of crony capitalism Russia is good enough to get you out of terrible, miserable poverty to at least, you know, people having cell phones and being able to feed their children, right? So I guess, yeah, that's my takeaway, is there is a method where people don't need to have this anymore, right? And there are people who like being the one who swoops in and helps. They always want to be the rich elite that comes in and helps them.
Sure.
But poor countries have gotten wealthy all over the world with the system. And I did not see a prescription for that in the book.
So you're saying, in your opinion, free enterprise is kind of the way for these countries out of their situation? It's the reason you and I are sitting here right now. It's the reason you guys either have a Samsung or an Apple phone. It's the reason you got this little thing right here. The reason we have all this equipment, right? Where we were sitting was not. Desperately poor places that were recipients of the IMF and World Bank that had to call them in, right? Even if you were wealthy, like Greece was. When I say wealthy, I don't mean like Mercedes-Benz wealthy. I mean wealthy in the global sense. You can feed your children. You have commerce, right? If you go the wrong route, like Greece did, some of the European countries,
that went back on free enterprise, they're now in the terrible situation of receiving money now when they used to be donor countries, right? Singapore, what a miserable swamp with absolutely no resources. And it is now an astonishing free enterprise system, right? You ever see the Social Network? Eduardo Saveron, he moved there. A lot of Americans moved there. Low taxes, simple. There are no lobbyists. You complain about big government and the influence of corporations, totally with you. The easiest way to do that is not give them something to lobby. There's no tax lobbying industry because they have a flat tax. Enormous waste of energy to do. So anyway, yes, that's the answer to your question. You don't have to be poor within a generation as a country. You do not have to be. There is a route. You've taken it. I've taken it. And you can be like a Singapore that is a donor country now. That when our parents were kids was a desperate poor place.
John, would you like to take issue with that? Is free enterprise the answer?
Well, I think you're talking here about a country. A country raises its standard of living, it raises its economics. But I'm talking really about the people within the country. And so today, we happen to have 2.5 billion people on this planet who are living beneath the poverty level of $2 a day, and another couple of billion that are making maybe $3 or $4 a day. They're living miserable, miserable lives. And many of them are living in countries where we've seen economic growth, yes, but that economic growth, it only reflects the very wealthy people in that country. We even find the same in the United States today, where we can have increased levels of unemployment, increased foreclosures, and yet our economy is growing because a few people are making a lot of money. And we've seen this all over the world, where a few wealthy people skew the economics. Mm-hmm. In the United States alone, since this book was written, in fact, since the last recession ended in 2008, we've seen that 95% of the growth in the economy has gone to 1% of the population of the United States. The average American has gotten $1 for every $1 billion generated in our economy. 90% of us are worse off today. 7 out of 10 people in the world live in countries with greater inequality today than 30 years ago, and those are World Bank statistics. I mean, so yes, we can see economic growth in many of these countries, and that's exactly what I grew up with. I came out of business school. I thought when I went into this business I was doing the right thing, because we can show statistically that if we put several $billion into building up infrastructure in a country, the GDP increases. And that looked good to me when I first went into this business. But what I discovered as I got deeper into it, that just showed that the rich were getting a lot richer and a lot more powerful, and the poor were worse off. And we've seen this over and over. And now we're seeing it so strongly in the United States, where the middle class is collapsing in this country. You mentioned Venezuela. What happened in Venezuela was a guy named Perez, who was president of Venezuela, took a country that had the largest middle class in Latin America, from that down to having one of the smallest middle classes, and he became the richest man in Latin America at the time, or one of the richest.
You think Chavez is on the right route?
No, not at all. I think Chavez has been a terrible administrator.
Why is that?
Well, because he was a lousy administrator. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. But that's just, he was a lousy administrator, and the fellow that's followed him is even worse. So
why was he a lousy administrator? I mean, if we were to open the gates today, Venezuelans would come to the United States if they could. They would go to Canada if they could. Why do you think that is? And why, if we had open borders with Singapore, say, astonishing economic opportunity, right? Americans have given up their passports, and the way the U.S. government does it, it's a nightmare. You have to pay all this money to go there. Why do you think dirt poor countries that have adopted my philosophy, which is simplicity, take power out of government, you don't have crony capitalism because you can't, because government doesn't have the power to grant it, right? I'm with you on these, these countries where a few families have it. When I went to business school at Columbia, the poorer the country was, the richer the student was from there, right?
Yeah,
if you met
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Right.
And I think, if you talk about people going to Singapore, but huge numbers of Americans are going to Costa Rica, to Panama, to Guatemala, to Ecuador, to Colombia. I go to South America. I just came from San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and there's a huge American community there, and in Cancun, and in so many of these places. We got more.
Costa Rica is one of the only countries in the world. I went to the embassy the other day. I went on vacation there last summer. I went to the embassy. It was kind of cool. And he says, the only countries in the world where the United States has a net population switch, meaning there are fewer Costa Ricans here than there are Americans there. Retirees, right? It's a nice place. You're out of your mind if you think there are more Americans trying to get to Mexico than Mexicans coming here, because there are 0 people, including Barack Obama, that think that.
Why do you think Central Americans are coming here?
poverty and violence.
Yeah, what's gone wrong with their economies? It's NAFTA, it's what we call our free trade agreements. The fact of the matter is...
So you think they were thriving in the 60s with socialism?
It wasn't
with
about socialism.
High taxes and not trading? The smaller the country you are, the more you need trade.
No, I'm not talking about socialism versus capitalism here. I'm talking about the policies that we economic hitmen set up that I was behind in my time. NAFTA set up so that, let's say that a U.S. agribusiness can produce a unit of corn for $5, and a Central American farmer can produce it for $3. But the agribusiness here gets a $3 subsidy. So that means the agribusiness here can sell that unit of corn for $2.50 and make a profit in Central America, whereas the Central American has to sell it for $3 plus. And they can't subsidize their things in Central America because they don't have enough money to. They can't put up tariffs because of these trade agreements. And so all these peasants, all these farmers who are gone broke in Latin America, I know them. I speak Spanish fluently. I spend a lot of time with them. They're coming here not because they want to be in the United States. They're living miserable lives here, and they're sending all the money they make back home to their families. Meanwhile, our agribusinesses are going over, taking over their land, producing flowers and cauliflower to send back here, and our industries are going down there, opening sweatshops because labor's cheap, because people are desperate, and that's because of the free trade agreements.
Well, I appreciate your endorsement of the free enterprise system, which you said about agribusiness and subsidies. Because corporations lobbying government to get subsidies is the polar opposite of the free enterprise system, right? But that will always happen forever as long as the power has the government to grant it. Remember when I said there's no tax lobbying industry? There isn't even a tax preparation industry in Hong Kong or Singapore. Most countries don't have like a business of preparing your taxes, right? It's a very minor event in your life, right? It's only here we have this, right? And it is because of this sort of anti-free market view. Believe me, bipartisan, putting tax credits in. But when you say agribusiness subsidy, I appreciate you taking a free enterprise view, because that is politically connected firm.
I totally believe in free enterprise.
Carving
the real free
enterprise.
Real free
absolutely
enterprise.
Right. But what like when you say top 5 tips for entrepreneurs, right? I mean, look at the countries in the Doing Business Index. How long is it to start a business? How easy it is to start a business, right? That has a hell of a track record performing how those children are able to eat or not, right? Remember, you never have to pay a bribe for something, for a permit, if you don't need a permit. You never have to pay a bribe to get over the border, right? Which is what, if you had free trade, because who bribes to do what, right? So there are parties that want to keep all these government restrictions to enrich themselves. China, Russia. Dude, none of those border guards ever want free trade. They're making a fortune with right? You got a load of goods coming in. I can sit here for a week or it can go right now. How much is it worth to you, right? This could never happen in my ideal world, which we're not anywhere near, not near yours either. I know that. But it could never happen. Do you want bribes, kickbacks, corruption? Then please give government lots of power.
Well, do you want a wall between Central America and here? Is that the way we're going to stop the corruption?
No, I mean, if it was the way my way, where are you complimenting the places that never need to have economic hitmen come in because they had hard money, which you never talk about? Central banks, deflation, having high inflation, terrific if you're rich enough to have debt, right? I have a bunch of debt. I have investment properties. I love inflation. It makes my life so much better.
Because you live in a country that can write the world's currency.
But we don't have... Most of these places have terrible central banking and high inflation. They have for history. The reason it costs more to invest there, the reason their bonds have higher interest rates, because they should, because they have high currency risk. You need to have... You'll never, ever have a society, we never have, we never will, that does not have a stable currency and hard money in some manner. You can peg it, you can do what you want, you can have good central banking, you can put it to gold.
So what you're arguing for is a Federal Reserve and that controls
hard money of any sort. Anywhere where people can have a better life for their kids has always had hard money.
How are you suggesting that the Bolivians and the Ecuadorians and people like that get their hard money that you're talking about? I mean, actually, we forced Ecuador to go on the dollar. The IMF forced them to go on the dollar.
Do you think it raised or lowered inflation?
It destroyed the poor people.
How?
Ecuador was at a population of about 14 million when that happened, and went down to 10 because people had to get out. I'll tell you how, because before the dollarization, a dollar was worth about 2,500 sucres, something like that. On the day that they set the conversion, a dollar was worth 12,000 sucres. So all the people in that country who had sucres suddenly lost half their money vis-a-vis the rest of the
You've
world.
made my point.
Vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
When you say they had to switch currencies, you know why they had to switch currencies?
So
their currency was a mess, because they had to have economic hitmen came in. A place that was prosperous would never have this happen in the first place, and no place with hard money ever happens.
What I'm trying to say, though, is that the wealthy people in that country, the ones who had their money in U.S. banks or in dollars, as well as the big multinational corporations, they doubled their money, whereas the peasants lost half their money.
And we agree on this because those terrible currencies, terribly managed, always screw over the local people. The other people either can afford debt, in which inflation is good in that currency, or you have it in a separate currency altogether, or you have it all shit.
The conversion's what screwed the local people.
And are you trying to tell me that in 1920, if Ecuador had been a hard money, free enterprise, no bribes, set up a business anytime you want, no permits, total free enterprise place, again, hard money, right, had a reasonable central bank, you can do it a bunch of ways, right? Had they done that, you never would have ever set foot there except to backpack, because they never would have needed it.
So I want to continue this conversation. We're having a very lively conversation, so I don't want to interrupt too much. But I do want to ask you, kind of talking about the points that you've mentioned, Kyle, 11 things corporations can do. This is in one of the new chapters in your book. The first suggestion that you make for corporations is, quote, include in your goals and mission statement a commitment to serving the public, the natural environment, social harmony, and justice. Is this always possible for corporations? And then we'll have Kyle respond as well. And then are U.S. corporations achieving this? Or
yeah,
where?
Thanks. You know, the first 100 years the United States was a country, no corporation could get a charter in any state unless it proved or demonstrated that it was going to serve a public interest. Charters lasted on average for 10 years, and then the corporation had to go back and show that it, in fact, had served a public interest. So it was nothing about profits. And then it could renew its charter. That all ended in the late 1800s when John D. Rockefeller decided that he wanted to have something different for his oil company. So he went to the state of Delaware and said, hey, to legislators, hey, you know, if you change this law, I'll pay really high taxes here. You legislators can pay yourselves a really high salary. Next he went to New Jersey, and it kept going. You know, things have deteriorated since then. When I was in business school, I was taught that a good CEO, this is the late 60s, a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for his investors. And in addition to that, he takes really good care of his employees, takes a cut in salary before he lays anybody off. Imagine that in today's atmosphere. A good CEO takes good care of his suppliers and his customers, and is a good community citizen, pays taxes. Our corporations don't pay taxes. I mean, how do you justify that when they use so much of our infrastructure? Pays taxes and also gives money to education, to recreational facilities, is a good citizen. That all changed in the 1970s when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize, and one of his main contentions was that the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And I maintain that that's a very, very sick, insane policy that's led us to a globally crumbling economy. Let's face it, we know things are being destroyed. We know that the glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising. We know there's tremendous terrorism. We know there's climate change. Things are crumbling. 5% of us live in the United States and consume 30% of the world's resources. That's not a model for the world. And it's all happened because we've moved away from that principle that a corporation is here to serve the public, not just the investors. Yes, corporations should pay its investors a decent rate of return. We need investors. We need to create new technologies for energy, transportation, communications, everything. So we need to pay those investors a decent rate of return. But beyond that, we need to tell corporations, listen, take care of us, we the people. This isn't just about those 62 people who have as many assets as half the world's population.
Great. I want to give Kyle a chance to respond to that. Do you think it is possible for all corporations? And
there's a bunch there. With American companies, you saw Burger King, iconic company, moved to Canada, right? And you see this, what they call inversions, right? Remember the Gates test. Open the gates, where do people want to go? No international merger wants to be in the United States. That is a terrible thing, right? And the people who complain about that, and there's very little knowledge of it, don't realize how terribly this country treats international corporations. It's not a big deal if you're just a U.S. company. But even then, it's kind of screwed up because you compete against people who otherwise. We tax your money all around the world, okay? It's the U.S. government treating capital very poorly, and it's more mobile. even I think that you should treat it better, but even if you don't care about how you treat corporations, strange thought, but even if you didn't, you should, because that's the world we're in, right? We have to compete. And complaining when companies move abroad, like Barack Obama says, they're cheating on their taxes, the taxes you owe in your U.S. operations don't change. Complaining about they always want to leave, they always want to leave, they always want to leave. Some guy who keeps getting married, but his wives keep leaving him over and over and over again, should that guy complain at the women or the other guys he dates, or maybe look at his own behavior, okay? You should always want people to come here, and that's what's happening. That when people complain about U.S. taxes and they treat it poorly, they're like that guy blaming the women instead of himself.
Oh, okay. Well, that is all we have time for. And again, the book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Thanks to Mr. Perkins for joining us to discuss the book, and to Kyle Hauptman of the Main Street Growth Project for his critique. And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Jordan Campbell, and we will see you next time.